Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be with you. And thank you for the invitation and for allowing me to come down from Berkeley to be with you in here and to address this important topic. Actually, we're having an Islamophobia conference at Berkeley this weekend, Friday and Saturday. We have about 24 different speakers coming to address Islamophobia from a variety of perspectives. Luckily for everyone, it will be live cast, so you could actually go to UC Berkeley Center for Race and Gender, and you actually will be able to listen live for the presentations. And I think with us in here is Professor Tariq Ramadan, who will be giving the opening speech, not to put him on the spot, but hopefully everyone is able to tune in to the conference. Now, we produced last year the status of Islamophobia in the US with a partnership with CARE. And it was important for us to situate where Islamophobia is studied. It's often been the case that intersectionality with Islam and Muslims, it takes place either in Middle East studies, and therefore it confines the study of Islam and Muslims in the US as part of the Middle East conflict or Middle East studies. And therefore, even as Muslims are brought into the conversation, they're brought in as externalities and part of a foreign policy consideration. So that's one. The second part is a cluster of Eastern religions in religious studies. And I was actually invited to speak on a panel about religions in America. And they had Eastern religions on one side of the table and then Western religions on the side of the table. And I looked at the Western side of the table, I didn't see any Native Americans. Because on this Western side, there were a number of Christian denominations, which I work with, and also individuals from the Center for Jewish Studies. And I looked, I said, both Moses and Jesus arrived to the United States just earlier than us, and therefore they should be on this side of the table, because all of those represented on this panel are Eastern religions that possibly were given green card earlier than us. So in here is also to situate how we frame Islamophobia. For our project at Berkeley, we insisted that we study Islamophobia in the area of race and gender, because what we are looking at Islam and Muslims in the United States as a racialized, otherized group. And this gives us the understanding that what we're studying is the location of a group of recent immigrants. Some actually have been in this country from the period of the slave, 10 to 20%, according to Sylviana Diouf, of African slaves were of Muslim background, and therefore to locate it within the history of America and also the contestation relative to new immigrants and ability of immigrants to integrate, and the integration is also have to be put between two parentheses, because often the integration is that you have to integrate to the other, not that you are able to integrate on your own terms and maintain certain aspects of who you are, but also be able to create areas of common discourse. Now, I will speak a little bit about the introduction of Islamophobia in political campaigns. Sharia has its problems. Why? Because we have a divine revelation that is constantly being acted upon by human agents. So there is aspects of problematics within Sharia. But the discourse in America is not about solving the finer details of Sharia. I doubt anybody in the Republican Party is sitting and thinking about how to deal with the finer points of the Sharia, whether istishab or istihsan or public interest is the issue. This is about campaigns, this is about elections, this is about seats of power, and there is nothing more powerful than to cast a group that does not have any power in society as the center of the problem. If 70 million, supposedly the number of the Christian coalition members, can put the 10 Commandments into the US Constitution and take over the government, how do we expect about 2.5 million Muslim adults, or 6 million to take over the country. This fear and threat is a fomented threat. Now, during the 1988 presidential election, Lee Atwater, whom we know, the campaign manager for George H.W. Bush, the father, summoned Larry McCarthy to produce what would become the infamous Willie Horton advertisement. In 1986, Horton, a convicted felon, was given a weekend pass under a Massachusetts prison furlough program. He did not return to prison and resurfaced a year later after raping a woman. According to BBS, the ad McCarthy produced used a menacing mugshot of an African-American criminal and was widely denounced as appealing to racial prejudices. The ad's explicit goal, according to Atwater, was to make Horton every suburban mother's greatest fear. Atwater described the desired outcome for the ad by saying, by the time this election is over, Willie Horton will be a household name. The ad proved to be critical in helping Bush win the election in the White House in 1988. During the 2008 election, which is the Obama election, and I know that many of us celebrated having the first Muslim president in the White House. At least 24% of the American public still believe so. Another 46 believe that he's not Christian. But in the 2008 election, Islamophobia was deployed. Many of us remember the distribution of Obsession, which was a documentary about radical Islam. 28 million copies were distributed in swing states. If it was a fear of Islam, it should have been distributed to every household in this country. But it was distributed strategically to 28 million to critical states where possibly the campaign of McCain and Obama were contesting, and there was a close margin, possibly, and therefore to swing the election one way or the other. Therefore, this expenditure of almost $17 million to distribute Obsession was directly linked to election campaign. During the 2010 midterm election, Larry McCarthy of the Willie Horton ads was summoned again. The Horton ads creator began producing Islamophobic television spots for a number of politicians and political hopefuls. McCarthy again appealed to prejudice of average Americans' fear and helping to normalize anti-Muslim discourses in political and public campaigns. So once again in here, his expertise in the Willie Horton has been deployed once again in Islamophobic content. I maintain that the central purpose of today's generation of Islamophobic political ads is to make Islam and Muslims synonymous with terrorism and to define the religion and its adherents as threat to Americans' values and freedom. If Willie Horton was suburban's mother's greatest fear, Islam and Muslims would be America's greatest fear. And that's how the campaign is being constructed. A cursory look at American history provides an illustrative evidence that fomenting fear, racism, and otherizing has been a norm rather than an exception. Just look at the history of Native Americans, how they were represented, African Americans, and we continue to suffer from this, Irish and Italians, and the threat of the Catholics in general, Jews, Chinese Americans during the Chinese Exclusionary Act, Japanese in the internment, which actually mirror how the Muslims are being looked upon today, as well as Latinos. Just on the subject of immigration, just a side track, if we think about Latino immigration and also Huntington's thesis of clash of civilization, as he shifted from the discussion of the clash of civilization with Islam and Muslims toward the Latinos, we could also see how fear of Islam and Muslims is impacting Latinos today. For example, we're building the wall on the Mexican-American border in the south. And we're using it as part of securing our border and securing the threat that possibly terrorists will use to enter America. And I often actually ask the question, if a Muslim, and this is a question, if a Muslim wants to carry a terrorist act and wants to enter into the country, which border would they like and most likely cross? The Mexican or the Canadian border? Most Muslims, actually, in the Muslim world, either speak French or English because they've been colonized either by England or France, with possibly the Italians who didn't actually stay for long. And therefore, a Muslim who wants to enter the United States, to go to Mexico, he will have to spend 2 years studying Spanish as a second language because no habla español, before they are able actually to come to America to threaten our country. That shows you how the threat of terrorism has been used, once again, within our domestic discourses vis-a-vis the Latinos. Now, why make Islam the enemy? Once again, in midterm election campaigns, elements of the Tea Party movement employed masterfully crafted ads to transform Islam into a singular, monolithic, and all-encompassing ideological and civilizational threat. A threatening ideology called Islam was constructed as the new evil. Meanwhile, Islamophobes were able to cast themselves as the defenders of liberal democratic values and principles by focusing their campaign around the constructed ideology rather than the individuals or group of individuals. They say, we have nothing against Muslims. We actually are positive, we want them to be included, but we're against Islam. And this is, once again, is using this aspect of separating the individual from their belief. And therefore, if you believe in Islam, then essentially you are putting yourself in the negative rather than thinking of the individuals represents their values and how they come into their practices, whether Islam or otherwise. The problem they were able to say was not your Muslim neighbors and friends who were as deserving of universal rights as anyone else, but the ideology of violence espoused by Islam. The institution and individuals producing and disseminating Islamophobia in the United States are seeking to disenfranchise the growing American Muslim community. And that's why it's important to read Fear Inc. as well as others. Wajahat Ali and the people who produce it are excellent researchers. And we currently are working on a similar project at Berkeley, which is Islamophobia in the Campaign Trail. This is done in terms of disfranchising the Muslim community. This is done by casting Islam as something to be feared, as the un-American other. And if successful, this campaign will lead to isolation and distrust of the American Muslim community by the broader American society. This isolation can push some members of the American Muslim youth toward disenfranchisement and marginalization, which could be manipulated into senseless extremism and possibly violence, as well as providing a ripe opportunity for entrapment to justifying further securitization of the American society. We have securitization of the American society to the help. Hence, Islamophobia may be seen as a tool to promote, push, induce radicalization in certain segments of the American Muslim community, providing further rationalization for the domestic war on terrorism and all the funding and resources connected to it. At a time of deep economic recession, unemployment, lack of opportunity, a collapsing healthcare system, or Obamacare, even if you have voted for it, dependence on foreign oil, all of these issues that are confronting us, we find it's the Muslims that are our problem. And therefore, we forget that it's not the Muslims who caused the unemployment. It's not the Muslims who are causing the oil crisis. It's not the Muslims that actually are impacting our healthcare. Most often, if you go to a hospital to seek healthcare, it's a Muslim who's taking care of you because of the preponderance of the number of Muslims in our own society. Now, once again, let me go back to fear, racism, and the ballot box. Because we have to be true and honest to ourselves. Racism works. For example, many years during the early period of the Bush campaign as well as the campaign of Clinton, it was welfare reform that was at the forefront of the agenda. Does anybody remember the ads that were carried out on TV during the welfare reform? It was the face of a black woman. And it is the black woman with her children that was cheating the system. And therefore, welfare was sold, reform of the welfare was sold to the American public by a racialized image of an African-American woman, even though at the time 65% of welfare women who were on the welfare rolls were white women. Had we put a white woman face with her kid and created an ad to sympathize with her, we would have had a different outcome altogether. And therefore, race still occupy an important part in our own societal discourse, and I think the case in Florida is one illustrative example of this. In his book, Communication Power, Manuel Castells maintains that voters are mainly motivated by feelings of fear and anxiety. Furthermore, Castells writes that decision-making has two paths, one based on framed reasoning, the other directly emotional. It is often emotional brain that campaign issues are framed to engage. Fear, in particular, is an emotional trigger point, and that's why constructing the fear is very important in this case. Also, while Castells argues that neural brain networks responding to self-referential stimuli construct our reality, his use of the theory of effective intelligence provides a more applicable framework for analyzing political psychology, supporting the notion that emotional appeals and rational choices are complementary mechanisms. Interestingly, effective intelligence theory proposes that two emotions are particularly relevant for political behavior. These emotions are enthusiasm and its opposite, depression, and fear, with its counterpart calm. Ted Brader's work on the role of emotions elicited, Ted Brader's work on the role of emotions elicited in political advertisement and their translation into voting behavior indicates that fear ads tend to erode the opponent's base of support among voters, while highlighting the importance of voting for those viewers made anxious by the ads. Thus, the usage of fear ads, which tends to emphasize domestic dangers, is unsurprisingly in close midterm elections with high stakes such as control of the Congress and the Senate and the White House. In this case, the national security fears connected to 9/11 were transformed into political ads fashioned by right-wing ideologues, both in here and Europe, focusing on the purported domestic threat and role or status of the Muslim American community in the war on terrorism. The real strategic goal, this approach, is to increase voter turnout for their base, while chipping away margins from the opponents, or alternatively, bringing more of the dependents into their camp. As many of us understand, the American election is it's a very narrow margin that shifts the election one way or the other. Those committed to the Democratic Party and those are committed to the Republican Party, and therefore the struggle becomes about a shifting 5 percentage points one way or the other. If you also think the Republican Party is increasingly having difficult time appealing to communities of color in the United States. Their communities of color numbers, whether it's Latinos, Asian Americans, they tend to have some success in Asian Americans, but African Americans, as well as Arab and Muslim communities who traditionally actually voted Republican, even in the year 2000, they collectively voted for the Bush ticket. What we see is the Republican Party being increasingly representative of one large segment of the American society. Therefore, one way to actually win and campaign is by using fear in such a way to shift segments of the independents to their side and shave a few percentage points of the Democratic Party. Now, to illustrate this, how many here know about the Victory Mosque? Or Ground Zero Mosque? Ground Zero Mosque. What happened to it? Why we don't have any more coverage? Why we're not having discussions? Because if the Muslims were seeking Victory Mosque, they'll still be seeking Victory Mosque today, yesterday, or in November of 2010. If you remember, in June of 2010, the concept of the Victory Mosque was picked up in order to get traction for election and began to be articulated as part of the campaign to bring the base out at a very critical juncture. Immediately after the 2010 November midterm election, there was no mentioning of Victory Mosque, even though that the project, the program, and those involved are still there. If it was close to ground zero, in 2010 is still close to is close to ground zero today. And therefore, what we are seeing is that Islamophobia worked as planned in the 2010 election, and Tea Party and Republican candidates in general rode the effects to statistical margins of victory in key races. Now, not to only speak of Republicans in here and being accused of being an anti-Republican speaker, Democrats joined hand in the key race in Arizona with Harry Reid, confronted with a campaign, a hard Senate-fought campaign, and his opposition used Islamophobia. He actually went and spoke against Ground Zero Mosque because he did not want to lose the election. Meaning that Democrats, come push to shove, they will join in the bandwagon and ride Islamophobia in order for them to guarantee their seats. And therefore, we have to be very keen on understanding for the Muslim community as well as those allies that are attempting to fight Islamophobia to understand the political landscape, and therefore your friends might leave you out in the altar and run out because of their interest of maintaining their seats. Thank you.
Thank you.